Get out in 48 hours. She's moving in. That's what my husband said to me on a Thursday night, standing in the living room of the house I bought with my own money. The house where I'd built a $12 million company from scratch, while he spent his days on the couch playing video games. I should have crumbled right there. That's what he expected. Tears, begging, maybe some pathetic plea for him to reconsider our 6-year marriage. Instead, I smiled. "Let me call my lawyer," I said. The look on his face, that flicker of confusion, that tiny crack in his arrogant smirk, that's the moment I knew I was going to destroy him. My name is Vanessa Cole. I'm a software developer who created a productivity app that exploded beyond my wildest dreams. While my company was growing, my husband Dominic was shrinking. He quit his sales job to support me, which really meant living off my success while I worked 16-hour days, and he leveled up in Call of Duty, and now he wanted me out of my own house in 2 days, so his 24-year-old girlfriend could move in. Madison, the personal trainer from his gym, I'd seen her Instagram. All green smoothies and motivation quotes. I bet she had no idea what she was walking into, but I'm getting ahead of myself. This story isn't just about a cheating husband and his delusional demands. It's about how 48 hours became the countdown to his complete annihilation, how every second he gave me became a weapon I used against him. It's about the moment I stopped being the wife who made excuses for him and became the woman who made him pay for every single lie. This is a long story, and it's going to get intense. To make sure you don't miss what happens when Saturday arrives, when Madison shows up at my door with her suitcases and dreams of a luxury life, you can follow along with the stories shared. Trust me, you'll want to see how this plays out. Because when Dominic 8 hours, he had no idea he'd just started the clock on losing everything he thought he was entitled to. I didn't sleep that Thursday night. How could I? My husband had just told me to get out of my own house so another woman could take my place. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, cold, satisfied expression, like he'd already won. But something was off about Dominic wasn't smart enough to come up with the confidence in his voice, the specific 48-hour deadline, the way he'd already packed a bag like he knew exactly how this would. It felt rehearsed. I lay there in our bed while he slept in the guest room, my mind racing the detail of the past few months, the late-night gym sessions, the new cologne, the way he'd suddenly become interested in our finances, asking questions about the company's valuation and our assets. And then I remembered something that made my stomach drop. 3 weeks ago, I'd come home early and found Dominic on the phone in his car, still parked in our driveway. He'd looked startled when he saw me, quickly ending the call. When I asked who it was, he said it was just his buddy Tyler talking about fantasy football. But it was April. Football season had been over for months. At the time, I'd brushed it off. Now, lying in the dark, that small lie felt enormous. Friday morning came with gray light filtering through the curtains. I heard Dominic moving around downstairs, probably making himself breakfast, like this was just another normal day, like he hadn't just blown up our entire life. I grabbed my phone and started scrolling through our bank statements. We had a joint account that I'd set up years ago, back when I still believed in the whole what's mine is yours marriage thing. I rarely checked it anymore. I had my business accounts, and Dominic used the joint account for household expenses and his personal spending. My hands started shaking as I looked at the recent transactions. Transfers. Multiple transfers to an account I didn't recognize. $5,000 here, $8,000 there. The amounts were large enough to matter, but small enough that I might not notice if I wasn't looking carefully. I added them up. $60,000? Gone. The transfers had started 4 months ago, around the same time Dominic began acting different. Around the same time Madison started posting gym selfies with my husband conveniently in the background. I felt sick. This wasn't just about him falling in love with someone else. This was planned. Calculated. He'd been stealing from me while pretending everything was fine, kissing me goodbye in the mornings while draining our account behind my back. I wanted to run downstairs and confront him right then, throw the evidence in his face and watch him scramble for excuses. But something stopped me. If I showed my hand too, he'd know I was onto him. He'd cover his tracks, delete evidence, maybe even speed up whatever plan he had in mind. No. I needed to be smarter than that. I got dressed slowly, deliberately, putting on the navy suit I wore for important investor meetings. I needed armor for what came next. When I walked downstairs, Dominic was at the kitchen counter eating cereal, scrolling through his phone with that same casual attitude that made me want to scream. He looked up at me with something close to pity in his eyes, like I was a problem he'd already solved. He reminded me again that I had until Saturday morning, that he expected me to be gone before Madison arrived, that this would be easier for everyone if I just cooperated. I listened to every word, my face carefully neutral, while inside I was cataloging everything. Every entitled assumption, every condescending tone, every lie. I told him I understood, that I'd start packing my things, that I just needed to make a few phone calls first to figure out where I'd stay. The relief on his face was almost comical. He actually believed I was going to roll over and let this happen. I drove to my office in downtown Seattle, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. My assistant caught one look at my face and knew not to ask questions. I locked myself in my office and made the most important call of my life. Patricia Santos answered on the second ring. We'd worked together when I incorporated my company, and I knew she handled high-stakes divorces on the side. Her reputation was legendary. She was the lawyer angry wives called when they wanted blood. I told her everything. The 48-hour ultimatum, the girlfriend, the missing $60,000. Patricia listened without interrupting, and I could practically hear her mind working through the phone. When I finished, there was a pause. Then she said something that made my heart start pounding with a different kind of energy. Not fear, not sadness. Pure, focused determination. She told me Dominic had made a critical mistake. She told me that what he'd done with that money wasn't just wrong, it was illegal. And she told me that if I gave her 24 hours, she could make sure he regretted every single choice that led to... I authorized her to do whatever was necessary. Cost didn't matter. I wanted scorched earth. Patricia got to work immediately. While I sat in my office trying to focus on anything else, she was pulling records, filing motions, and preparing a strategy that would flip Dominic's entire plan on its head. By Friday evening, she called me back with news that made me actually smile for the first time in 24 hours. She'd found something bigger than I'd imagined. Dominic hadn't just consulted one lawyer about divorce. He'd consulted 3 different attorneys over the past 6 months, shopping around for the one who'd tell him what he wanted to hear, that he could take half of everything I'd built. He'd been planning this for half a year. While I was working myself into exhaustion building my company, while I was coming home and trying to be a good wife, while I was believing his lies about supporting my dreams, he was plotting how to rob me blind and replace me with someone younger. The evidence was all there in consultation records, email trails, calendar appointments. He'd been methodical, careful, strategic, but he'd forgotten one crucial detail, one thing that would unravel his entire plan. And I was about to use it to take everything away from... Saturday morning arrived with sharp, cold sunlight cutting through my bedroom windows. I'd barely slept again, but this time it wasn't fear keeping me awake. It was anticipation. Patricia had worked through the night. At 6 a.m, she'd sent me a text that made my pulse race, with something that felt dangerously close to joy. The message was simple. We have everything. Be ready at noon. I spent the morning doing something strange. I packed a bag. Not because I was actually leaving, but because I needed Dominic to believe I was. I needed him comfortable, confident, assured that his plan was working exactly as he'd designed it. I could hear him downstairs humming, actually humming. Like this was the best day of his life. Like he was about to start fresh in my house with his new girlfriend, funded by my money, living the life I'd built. Around 11, my phone buzzed with a message from a number I didn't recognize. It was Madison, asking if I'd be gone by 2 because that's when her Uber was arriving with her things. The audacity of it made me laugh out loud. She was coordinating my exit like I was a piece of furniture being removed to make room for the new decor. I responded that I'd be out of her way. I even added a smiley face. Then I called Patricia and told her it was time. What I hadn't told Dominic, what he never bothered to ask, was that I wasn't just some lucky tech entrepreneur who stumbled into success. I'd been careful, strategic, protected. When my app first started generating serious revenue 3 years ago, my accountant had sat me down for a conversation about asset protection. He'd been through a brutal divorce himself and warned me that success made you a target, even from people you trusted, especially from people you trusted. So I'd done something Dominic never knew about. I'd established an LLC before we got married, transferred my intellectual property into it, and structured everything so the company was legally separate from our marital assets. The house I'd bought 2 years before our wedding was in my name alone, purchased with inheritance money from my grandmother that was never community property, and the prenuptial agreement Dominic had signed 6 years ago, barely reading it because he was so eager to marry me. That prenup was ironclad. Patricia had reviewed it Friday night and actually called it a work of art. Dominic had no claim to my business, no claim to my house, no claim to anything except whatever was in our joint account, which, thanks to his theft, was now nearly empty anyway. But it got worse for him. So much worse. Patricia had pulled our complete financial records, and what she found made my blood run cold. The $60,000 Dominic had stolen, that was just what I'd noticed. The full amount was closer to $95,000, transferred over 6 months to an account he'd opened in his name only. He'd been funding his exit strategy with my money, paying for Madison's gym membership with my money, taking her to expensive dinners with my money, probably buying her gifts and making promises about their future together, all financed by stealing from his wife. But the discovery that made me actually gasp was buried in his email records, which Patricia had legally obtained through something called spoliation prevention, basically a court order to preserve evidence before he could delete it. Dominic had been texting with Madison for over 8 months, long before he claimed they'd gotten together. The messages were nauseating. He called me names I won't repeat. He complained about how I was always working, how boring I'd become, how I didn't appreciate. He told Madison he was going to take me for everything I had. That stupid tech women like me were easy targets because we were too busy coding to notice what was happening in our own marriages. That he'd consulted with lawyers who told him he could get half of my $12 million company in the divorce. He'd even sent her photos of our house, promising it would be theirs soon. He'd screenshot my business bank statements and calculated how much he thought he could get. He'd made spreadsheets, actual spreadsheets planning out their life together, funded by destroying mine. The most chilling part was a message from 3 weeks ago, right after I'd caught him on the phone in the driveway. He'd been talking to his lawyer, getting final confirmation of his strategy. The lawyer had apparently told him to force me out quickly, establish residency for himself and Madison, and then file for divorce claiming I'd abandoned the marriage. It was textbook financial abuse, designed to catch me off guard and overwhelm. But Dominic had made one catastrophic error in his planning. He'd assumed I was the same person he married 6 years ago, the junior developer who was flattered that a confident sales guy had noticed her, the woman who didn't know her own worth yet. He'd underestimated how much I'd changed, how strong I'd become, how building a multi-million-dollar company from nothing had taught me to recognize predators and protect what was mine. Patricia had filed an emergency motion Friday night. By Saturday morning, a judge had signed off on freezing all accounts connected to Dominic, issuing a temporary restraining order on our marital property, and granting me exclusive possession of the house pending divorce proceedings. She'd also done something beautifully vicious. She'd had a locksmith scheduled to arrive at my house at 11:30 to change every lock, and she'd arranged for 2 police officers to be present at noon to ensure the transition was peaceful. Because Dominic wasn't getting 48 hours to prepare, he was getting 48 minutes to get out. At 11:45, I watched from my upstairs window as the locksmith's van pulled up. Then Patricia's black Mercedes. Then the police cruiser. Dominic must have heard the commotion because he came outside, confusion spreading across his face. I could see him talking to Patricia, his body language shifting from confused to angry to panicked as she handed him document after document. I took a deep breath, checked my reflection in the mirror, headed downstairs. This was it. The moment months of his planning crashed into my 48 hours of preparation. And I was about to show him exactly what happened when you underestimated Vanessa. I walked down my staircase slowly, deliberately, my hand trailing along the banister I'd picked out when I bought this house. Every step felt significant, like I was descending into a courtroom where the verdict had already been decided. Through the front windows, I could see Dominic's face changing colors as Patricia continued talking. He looked like a man watching his entire world collapse in real time, which was exactly what was happening. I opened the door and stepped out onto my porch. The morning air was crisp, almost cold, and I was grateful for it. It kept me sharp. Dominic's eyes locked onto mine, and I saw something flicker there. Not regret, not apology, but calculation. Even now, even with 2 police officers standing 10 feet away and a lawyer handing him legal documents, he was trying to figure out how to manipulate this situation. He started toward me, his voice taking on that soft, reasonable tone he used when he wanted something. He told me this was all a misunderstanding, that we could talk about this inside, that we didn't need lawyers and police officers for what should be a private conversation between husband and wife. I almost admired the performance. He was good at this. The wounded husband act, the implication that I was being dramatic and vindictive over a simple relationship problem. But I'd spent the last 36 hours learning exactly who Dominic Warren really was. I'd read his messages calling me names. I'd seen his spreadsheets calculating my worth like I was a bank he was planning to rob. I'd traced every dollar he'd stolen while kissing me goodbye in the mornings. So, I stood there and let him talk, my face carefully neutral, while Patricia handed him another document. This one was the temporary restraining order. He had 30 minutes to collect his personal belongings and leave the property. Anything purchased with my money stayed. That included the 70-inch TV in the living room, the PlayStation 5, the king-size bed, the espresso machine, and the Audi in the garage. I watched his jaw clench as he processed that. He'd been driving my car for 2 years, and I could see the moment he realized he was about to lose that too. Then he made his critical mistake. He looked at me and said I couldn't do this, that half of everything here was his bylaw, that his lawyer had told him so. That's when Patricia stepped in with the prenup, the document he'd signed 6 years ago without reading carefully because he was so confident, so sure of himself, so certain that marrying me was going to be easy money once my career took off. I watched him take the paper with shaking hands. I watched his eyes scan the pages, watched understanding dawn on his face. The prenup wasn't some simple standard agreement. It was comprehensive, specific, and absolutely binding. He'd waived all rights to my business interests, all rights to property I owned before marriage, all rights to inheritance. In exchange, he'd received a token amount, $5,000 per year of marriage, which meant he was entitled to exactly $30,000 total, less than a third of what he'd already stolen. And that's when I saw something new cross his face. Not just panic, but real. One of the officers told him it was time to start collecting his things. Dominic looked at me one more time, and I could see him trying to read my expression, to find some crack in my armor, some sign that I might still fold if he just found the right words. I gave him nothing. My face was stone. He went inside, escorted by one of the officers, and I heard him moving around upstairs. Drawers open, the sound of hangers scraping across the closet rod, the small, defeated noises of a man's life being reduced to what could fit in 2 suitcases. Patricia stood next to me on the porch, her leather portfolio tucked under her arm. She asked me quietly if I was okay, and I realized I was better than okay. I was clear-headed, focused. There was no room for sadness or doubt anymore. That's when Dominic came back downstairs, bags in hand, and made his second critical mistake of the day. He told me I was making a huge error, that he had evidence of things that would destroy my reputation if this went to court, that I should reconsider before he was forced to reveal certain information about my company's finances. It was a bluff. I could see it in his eyes, the desperate gamble of a man with no cards left to play. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that Patricia had already subpoenaed every text message, email, and phone record. If he had real evidence of anything, we'd already have found it. Instead, all we'd found were his lies, his theft, and his detailed plans to commit fraud. I smiled at him, really smiled. I told him to do whatever he thought was necessary, that I'd see him in court, that my lawyers would be in touch about the $95,000 he owed me, plus interest, plus my legal fees. The color drained from his face. He hadn't known I'd found all of it. He'd thought I'd only noticed the most recent transfers. That's when I heard it. The sound of a car pulling up to the curb. We all turned to look. It was an Uber, and climbing out of the back seat with 3 large suitcases was Madison Chen, wearing workout clothes and an excited smile that died the moment she saw the scene on my lawn. She stood there frozen, her hands still gripping the handle of her roller bag, trying to make sense of the police cars, the lawyer, the locksmith's van, and her boyfriend standing on the porch with everything he owned in 2 bags. Dominic said her name, but it came out strangled, desperate, and I realized something in that moment. Something that gave me an idea so perfectly vicious that I almost felt bad about it. Almost. Because Madison wasn't really the enemy here. She was just another one of Dominic's victims. Someone he'd lied to and manipulated with the same skill he'd used on me. The difference was, she didn't know it yet. But she was about to. Madison walked slowly up the driveway, her roller bag bumping along behind her, her eyes darting between me, Dominic, and the police officers. I could see her mind working, trying to piece together what was happening, why this wasn't the romantic new beginning Dominic had promised her. I made a decision in that moment, a calculated choice that would serve 2 purposes. It would devastate Dominic's last shred of dignity, and it would free Madison from whatever web of lies he'd trapped her in. I stepped forward and introduced myself. Told her I was Vanessa, Dominic's wife. Her face went pale, but I kept talking before she could process that bombshell. I explained that Dominic had some things to tell her, and that she might want to hear them before she made any life decisions based on his promises. Dominic tried to interrupt, tried to pull Madison away, told her we could talk about this somewhere private. But Madison wasn't. She was staring at me with this horrible mixture of dawning understanding. So I did something that surprised even myself. I invited her inside, into my house, to have a conversation that would change everything. Patricia gave me a look that said this was either genius or insane, possibly both. The police officers stepped aside, and Madison, after a long pause, left her suitcases on the lawn and followed me through my front door. Dominic tried to come in too, but I told him his 30 minutes were almost up and he needed to stay outside. One of the officers made it clear that was non-negotiable. I sat Madison down in my living room, the room where Dominic had delivered his 48-hour ultimatum just 2 days ago, and I showed her everything. I pulled up the bank records on my laptop, showed her the transfers Dominic had made from our account to his secret account. $95,000 over 6 months. I explained how each withdrawal corresponded with an expensive date, a gift, a promise he'd made to her. Then I showed her the text messages Patricia had obtained, the ones where Dominic had bragged to his friends about his plan, how he was going to divorce his rich wife, take half her money, and set up a new life with a hot younger woman who didn't know any better. Madison's hands were shaking as she read. I watched tears start streaming down her face, and I felt something unexpected, not satisfaction, but genuine sympathy. She told me she'd met Dominic 8 months ago at the gym where she worked. He'd said he was separated, going through a difficult divorce, that his wife was a workaholic who'd stopped loving him years ago. He'd been so attentive, so complimentary, so different from the guys her age who only wanted hookups. He'd told her he owned a tech company, that the house we were sitting in was his, that once his divorce was finalized, they'd travel the world together, maybe start a fitness brand with her as the face of it. She'd believed every word. 2 weeks ago, he'd convinced her to quit her job at the gym, told her she didn't need to work anymore, that he'd take care of everything. She'd given up her apartment, put her furniture in storage, and turned down another job offer because Dominic had promised her this new life. And now she was homeless, unemployed, and realizing that the man she'd fallen for was a lie built on top of lies. I made us both coffee while she cried. I know that sounds strange, comforting your husband's mistress in your own kitchen. But Madison wasn't a villain. She was 24 years old, and she'd been conned by someone who'd had years to perfect his manipulation tactics. When she finally composed herself, she asked me what she should do. And that's when I gave her something Dominic never expected: power. I told her that what Dominic had done to her wasn't just morally wrong. It was legally actionable. He'd made fraudulent promises to induce her to give up her job and housing. That was a form of fraud. Patricia could refer her to a lawyer who specialized in these cases. Madison looked at me like I'd just handed her a weapon, which I suppose I had. Then I told her something else. Something I'd been planning since Patricia first laid out Dominic's full scheme for me. I explained that I was going to make sure Dominic paid back every cent he'd stolen, plus my legal fees, plus penalties and interest. But that money was going to take time to collect, and the courts would probably garnish his wages for years. However, if Madison wanted to file her own lawsuit for fraud, for intentional infliction of emotional distress, for whatever other charges applied, she'd be first in line to collect. She could make sure he spent the next decade working to pay back everyone he'd wronged. I watched understanding light up in her eyes. Then something else. Something that looked a lot like the determination I'd felt when Dominic first gave me his ultimatum. Madison pulled out her phone and started taking pictures of everything I'd shown her. The bank records, the text messages, the timeline of his lies. Patricia gave her the contact information for the lawyer, and Madison saved it immediately. When we walked back outside 20 minutes later, Dominic was sitting on the curb next to his 2 bags, looking like a man who'd just lost everything, which he had. Madison walked right past him without a word, grabbed her suitcases from the lawn, and called another Uber. She told me, thank you, and I told her to be strong, that she was young and talented, and this wasn't going to define her life. Then she looked at Dominic and told him he'd be hearing from her lawyer. The Uber pulled up, and she left. Dominic stood up, looking at me with something close to him. He said I'd turned her against him, that I'd poisoned her mind, that I was vindictive, and I let him finish his little speech. Then I said something that made his blood run. Told him Madison wasn't the only person he'd lied to who deserved to know. There were other people in his life who'd believed his stories, who'd trusted him, who'd thought he was someone he wasn't. His mother, for instance. His boss from his old sales job who'd written him a recommendation letter when he quit. His friends who'd been hitting him up for investment advice because they thought he was some tech entrepreneur. Dominic's face went white. He asked me what I was planning to do, and I smiled. Because the truth was, I didn't know yet, but I wanted him to spend every moment of the next few weeks wondering, waiting, afraid of who else might learn what kind of man he really was. Patricia handed him one final document, the formal divorce petition. He had 10 days to respond, or the court would grant everything by default. The officers told him it was time to leave the property. Dominic picked up his bags, looked at my house one last time, and walked away down the sidewalk because he didn't even have a car to drive. I stood on my porch and watched him disappear around the corner, getting smaller and smaller until he was gone. And then I went inside my house, locked my new locks, and finally let myself not sadness, not regret, and something else I hadn't expected. The beginning of a plan that would make sure no one else ever fell for. The house felt different after Dominic. A weight I hadn't realized. I spent Saturday evening doing something I hadn't done in months. I ordered takeout, poured myself a good glass of wine, and sat on my couch without thinking about work or marriage or except the fact that I'd survived the worst 48 hours of my life and come out winning. But Sunday morning brought clarity and a new kind of energy. Patricia called me at 9 a.m. with an update that made me sit up straight. Dominic had already hired a lawyer, some guy named Robert Fletcher, who apparently had a reputation for aggressive divorce tactics. Fletcher had sent over a response that was equal parts desperate and delusional. He was claiming that despite the prenup, Dominic was entitled to compensation for emotional labor and spousal support because he'd sacrificed his career to support mine. He wanted $50,000 immediately, plus $3,000 a month in alimony for the next 3 years. I actually laughed out loud. The audacity of it was almost impressive. Patricia told me not to worry, that Fletcher was throwing everything at the wall, hoping something would stick, but that we had an airtight case. Still, she warned me that Dominic was going to fight dirty. Men like him always did when they realized they were losing. That's when I made it. I wasn't just going to win this divorce. I was going to make sure Dominic's attempt to destroy me became a cautionary tale. I called my accountant, Marcus Chen, and asked him to do a complete forensic audit of every transaction Dominic had made using our joint account over the past 2 years. I wanted to know exactly where my money had gone. Every dinner, every purchase, every lie documented with a price tag. Marcus said it would take about a week, but he'd have a complete report. I told him money was no object. I wanted to know everything. Then I did something that felt both terrifying and necessary. I called my business partner, Sarah Mitchell. Sarah and I had co-founded the company together 4 years ago, though I owned 60% to her 40%. She was brilliant, sharp, and had always been quietly suspicious of Dominic. She'd never said anything directly, but I'd caught her watching him at company events with this analytical look, like she was trying to solve a puzzle she didn't like. I told her everything. The affair, the theft, the plan to take half the company, the divorce. There was a long silence on the other end of the phone. Then Sarah said something that surprised me. She told me she was glad I'd finally seen through him, that she'd been worried for years but hadn't wanted to overstep, that she'd noticed things. The way Dominic had started showing up at the office more often 6 months ago, asking questions about our revenue streams and investor relationships. The way he'd tried to get friendly with our CFO, asking about asset valuation over lunch. Sarah had thought he was just being annoying. Now she realized he'd been gathering intelligence for his divorce strategy. She told me she had something that might help. About 3 months ago, Dominic had cornered her at a company holiday party and started asking invasive questions about whether I'd ever discussed selling the company. When she'd brushed him off, he'd gotten drunk and said something that stuck with her. He'd said that I was too emotionally attached to the company to see it for what it really was, a golden ticket, that someone needed to make the smart financial decisions in our marriage because I was too busy playing tech entrepreneur to think strategically. Sarah had found it so offensive that she'd made a note of it in her phone that night, including the date and time. It was documented proof of Dominic's intent, that he'd viewed my company as his asset to liquidate, not my life's work to respect. I asked her to send that note to Patricia immediately. It was exactly the kind of evidence we needed to show the court that Dominic had never supported. He'd just been waiting to cash it out. Monday morning, I went back to work. My team had known something was wrong. You can't hide that kind of emotional devastation completely, but I'd kept the details private. Now I called an all-hands meeting and told them the truth. Not everything, but enough. I explained that I was going through a divorce, that there had been some financial impropriety, and that there might be legal proceedings that could involve the company peripherally. I assured them that none of this would affect their jobs or our operations, and that I was handling it with excellent legal counsel. The response surprised me. Person after person came to my office throughout the day offering support. Our lead developer, James, told me his sister had gone through something similar and gave me the name of a financial advisor who specialized in helping women protect their assets post-divorce. Our HR director, Keisha, shared her own story of leaving an abusive marriage and told me she was proud of me for fighting back. I'd spent so much time feeling isolated, like I had to handle this alone. But I was building something here, not just a company, but and they had my back. That afternoon, I got a call from an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. It was Madison. She sounded stronger than she had on Saturday, more composed. She told me she'd met with the lawyer Patricia recommended, and they were filing a civil suit against Dominic for fraud and emotional distress. She'd also discovered something I needed to know. When she'd gone back to retrieve some items from the storage unit where she'd put her furniture, she'd found something that didn't belong to her. A box of documents, papers that Dominic must have hidden there thinking they'd be safe. Madison had looked through them, and what she found made her immediately take photos and send them to her lawyer. Now, she was sending them to me. Bank statements from Dominic's secret account showing even more transactions I hadn't known about. Printed emails between Dominic and a financial advisor discussing offshore accounts. Notes in Dominic's handwriting outlining his divorce strategy, including tactics for hiding assets and manufacturing evidence that I was an unfit spouse. It was a roadmap of his entire plan, written in his own hand, and he'd been stupid enough to leave it in a storage unit he'd told Madison to rent in her name. I forwarded everything to Patricia immediately. Within an hour, she called me back, and I could hear the excitement in her voice. This was what she called a smoking gun. Irrefutable evidence of premeditated fraud and conspiracy to commit perjury. With this evidence, we could not only win the divorce cleanly, but potentially pursue criminal charges for the theft. Dominic had documented his own crimes, but Patricia told me something else, something that made my heart race. She'd done some digging into Robert Fletcher, Dominic's attorney. Fletcher had a history of representing clients in contentious divorces, but he also had a pattern. If presented with clear evidence that his client had lied to him, he tended to withdraw from cases rather than risk his reputation. If we sent Fletcher the documents Madison had found, along with proof that Dominic had stolen nearly $100,000 and lied about it, there was a good chance Fletcher would drop him as a client, and Dominic would have to find a new lawyer, start over, waste more money he didn't have, and watch his case fall apart in real time. Patricia asked if I wanted her to do it, to send the evidence to Fletcher and force Dominic into an even worse position. I thought about it for exactly 3 seconds. Then I told her yes. Send everything, because Dominic had spent months planning how to destroy me, and now I was going to spend every day dismantling the life he tried to build on the ruins of mine. Tuesday morning brought news that felt like victory wrapped in irony. Robert Fletcher had withdrawn from Dominic's case. Patricia called me at 7 a.m., barely containing her satisfaction. Fletcher had received our evidence package Monday evening. The documents from the storage unit, the bank records showing the full extent of the theft, Madison's testimony about the fraudulent promises, and Sarah's documented conversation from the holiday party. Fletcher had taken one look at the mountain of evidence proving his client had lied to him, stolen from his wife, and planned to commit perjury, and he'd filed a motion to withdraw before noon. The judge had granted it immediately. Dominic was now without legal representation, with a court date looming in 3 weeks, and faced with the reality that no decent lawyer would touch his case once they saw what we had on him. Patricia told me something else. Fletcher had included a note in his withdrawal stating that he'd advised his former client to settle immediately and avoid further legal exposure. It was lawyer speak for, "You're screwed, take whatever deal you can get." Here's what made me actually smile into my morning coffee. Dominic didn't take that advice. Instead, over the next few days, he started making noise. Angry, desperate noise. Marcus completed the forensic audit, and the results were even worse than I'd imagined. Over 2 years, Dominic had spent nearly $160,000 of my money. Not $95,000, $160,000. The difference was in the smaller transactions I'd never thought to question. The groceries that were twice what they should have been because he was buying expensive steaks and wine for dates with Madison. The gas charges for trips to her apartment across town. The hotel rooms for weekend getaways he'd told me were visits to his mother in Nebraska. His mother stuck with. I'd always had a cordial relationship with Dominic's mother, Carol. She was a retired school, practical and no nonsense, and I'd gotten the sense she wasn't thrilled with her son's decision to quit his job and live off his wife's income. But she'd always been polite to me, and I'd sent her flowers on her birthday every year. I wondered what Dominic had told her about our separation. Probably some story where I was the villain and he was the victim of a cold, career-obsessed wife. So I did something that would either be brilliant or cross a line I couldn't uncross. I called Carol. She answered on the third ring, and her voice was warm when she recognized mine. She asked how I was doing, and I could tell from her tone that Dominic hadn't told her anything yet. I took a breath and told her the truth. All of it. The affair, the theft, the plan to steal half my company, the way he'd manipulated Madison and left her homeless. I kept my voice calm and factual, letting the events speak for themselves. The silence on the other end of the phone lasted so long I thought she'd hung up. Then Carol started crying. Not delicate tears, but the kind of crying that comes from deep shame and disappointment. She told me she was so sorry that she'd raised him better than this, that she didn't understand how her son had become this person. She told me something I hadn't. Dominic's father had left them when Dominic was 12, running off with a woman from his office and leaving Carol with debt and a mortgage she could barely afford. She'd worked 2 jobs to keep Dominic in a good school district, to give him opportunities she'd never had. And now he'd become exactly like his father. Carol asked me what she could do. She said she had some savings, not much, but if I needed help recovering what Dominic had stolen, she wanted to contribute. She felt responsible. I told her absolutely not, that none of this was her fault, and that I wouldn't take a penny from her. But I asked if she'd be willing to do something else, if she'd be willing to testify as a character witness if this went to trial. To tell the court that Dominic had a history of financial irresponsibility and entitlement, that she'd warned him multiple times about taking advantage of my generosity. Carol agreed immediately. She said Dominic needed to face real consequences for once in his life, and if her testimony would help hold him accountable, she'd be there. We talked for another 20 minutes. She told me stories about Dominic's childhood, how he'd always wanted the easy path, how he'd charm his way out of trouble instead of taking responsibility, how she'd hoped marriage would mature him, but now she saw it had just given him a bigger target to exploit. Before we hung up, Carol said something that stayed. She told me she was proud of how I'd handled this, that I'd shown more grace and strength than her son deserved, and that she hoped someday I'd find someone worthy of the life I'd built. After that call, I sat at my desk for a long time, staring at nothing, because I'd just gained something I hadn't expected in this fight, not just evidence, not just legal leverage, but validation. Even Dominic's own mother could see what he'd become. Thursday afternoon, Patricia called with an update that shifted everything into final position. The court date had been moved up to the following Tuesday. The judge had reviewed the evidence we'd submitted and wanted to expedite the proceedings given the criminal nature of some of Dominic's actions. Dominic had finally found a new lawyer, a guy named Tony Ramirez who Patricia described as bottom tier, the kind of attorney who took cases other lawyers wouldn't touch. Ramirez had filed a response that was barely coherent, still trying to claim Dominic deserved spousal support despite the prenup, despite the theft, despite everything. Patricia told me to prepare for one final confrontation. The hearing on Tuesday would determine the divorce terms, the restitution amount, and whether criminal charges would be referred to the prosecutor's office. Everything I'd been building toward for the past 2 weeks would come down to one day in court. That evening, I did something I hadn't done since this all started. I went for a run through my neighborhood, the same route I used to take before my life became consumed with work, and a failing marriage I'd been too busy to notice was failing. The spring air was cool, and as I ran, how different I felt from the woman who'd come home 2 weeks ago to find her husband's bag packed and his ultimatum waiting. I wasn't sad anymore. I wasn't scared. I wasn't even angry. I was clear, focused, ready. And I'd discovered something about myself in these 2 weeks that I think I'd always known but never fully acknowledged. I didn't need anyone to fight my battles. I didn't need anyone to validate my worth or protect. I could do it myself, and I had. When I got back to my house, sweaty and breathless, I found an envelope taped to my... No postage, no return address, just my name written in handwriting I recognized. Dominic's handwriting. I opened it standing right there on my porch. Inside was a single piece of paper with 3 sentences. He said I'd destroyed his life over a misunderstanding, that he'd made mistakes, but I'd made him pay too high a price, and that I'd regret how far I'd taken this. I read it twice. Then I took a photo of it and sent it to Patricia with a message: add intimidation to the list. Because even now, even facing complete ruin, Dominic couldn't accept responsibility. He still saw himself as the victim. He still thought he could intimidate me into backing down, but he'd forgotten something crucial. Something he'd never really understood about me, even after 6 years of marriage. I didn't back down. Not from technical challenges in my work, not from tough investors or competitive markets, and definitely not from men who underestimate. Tuesday was going to be interesting. Tuesday morning arrived with gray skies that matched my mood. Serious, focused, and ready for storm. I dressed carefully. A charcoal suit that was professional but powerful. Simple jewelry, hair pulled back. I wanted to look like exactly what I was. A successful businesswoman who'd built something real and wasn't going to let anyone take it from her. Patricia met me outside the courthouse at 8:30. She had 2 associates with her, each carrying banker's boxes full of evidence. We'd prepared for every possible argument Dominic's lawyer might make, every excuse, every deflection. But nothing could have prepared me for what I felt when I walked into that courtroom and saw Dominic sitting at the defendant's table. He looked terrible. His suit was wrinkled, his hair uncombed, and he had dark circles under his eyes like he hadn't slept in days. Tony Ramirez sat next to him, shuffling papers with the nervous energy of a man who knew he was outmatched. Dominic's eyes found mine across the courtroom. I expected anger or defiance. Instead, I saw something that almost looked like pleading. Like even now, he thought he could make me feel sorry for him. I looked away and took my seat. Judge Andrea Morrison entered, a woman in her 60s with steel gray hair and a reputation for not tolerating nonsense. Patricia had told me Morrison was brilliant, fair, and had 0 patience for financial abuse cases. The hearing began with procedural items, but then Morrison did something unexpected. She said she'd reviewed all submitted evidence over the weekend and had some questions before hearing arguments. She looked directly at Dominic and asked him if he'd stolen money from the marital account to fund an extramarital affair. I watched Dominic's face turn red. Ramirez started to object, but Morrison cut him off. She told him this was her courtroom, and she'd ask whatever questions she deemed relevant. Dominic stammered something about the money being community property, that he had a right to use it. Morrison's expression didn't change. She asked if he'd hidden the transfers from his wife, if he'd lied about where the money was going, if he'd created secret accounts. Each question hit like a hammer. Dominic's answers became quieter, more evasive. Ramirez kept trying to interrupt, and Morrison kept shutting him down. Then she turned to the evidence. She held up the documents Madison had found in the storage unit, Dominic's handwritten notes outlining his divorce strategy. Morrison read directly from them, and hearing those words spoken aloud in a courtroom made them even more damning. Plans to manipulate the timeline of the separation, strategies for hiding assets, notes about how to make me look like an unstable spouse, ways to maximize his settlement while minimizing what I'd discover before it was too late. It was all there. His entire conspiracy laid bare in his own handwriting. Morrison asked Dominic if these were his notes. He tried to claim they were taken out of context, that he'd just been exploring options, that everyone considers different scenarios during a difficult separation. The judge's expression hardened. She told him that what he'd described wasn't exploring options. It was premeditated fraud, and she asked him directly, had he ever intended to negotiate this divorce in good faith? Or had his plan always been to deceive his wife and steal as much as possible? The courtroom was completely silent. Even Ramirez had stopped shuffling papers. Dominic opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Finally, he said he wanted what was fair, that he'd sacrificed his career for the marriage, that he deserved compensation. That's when Patricia stood up. The judge nodded for her to proceed. What happened next was the most satisfying 15 minutes of my life. Patricia presented the complete forensic audit. Every dollar Dominic had spent, every lie he'd told about where the money went, every hotel room, every gift, every expensive dinner with Madison while telling me he was visiting his mother. She presented the timeline showing he'd begun his affair and his theft simultaneously, 8 months before he claimed the relationship started. She presented the emails between Dominic and the financial advisor about hiding assets, evidence of attempted fraud that went beyond just stealing from our joint account. She presented Sarah's documented conversation where Dominic had referred to my company as a golden ticket and called me too emotional to make smart financial decisions. And then she presented something I hadn't known about until that morning. Patricia had subpoenaed Dominic's text messages with his friends. In those messages, he'd bragged about his plan. He'd called me names I won't repeat. He'd joked about how easy it was to manipulate me because I was always working. He'd even sent screenshots of our house and my car to his buddies, promising them he'd soon be living the high life off his tech wife's success. One message in particular made my stomach turn. 3 months ago, one of his friends had asked if he felt guilty about what he was planning. Dominic's response was 2 words. "She'll survive." Like I was just collateral damage in his quest for easy money. Like 6 years of marriage meant nothing. Like I was just a resource to be exploited and discarded. Patricia let that message sit in the silence of the courtroom for a long moment. Then she presented our settlement demand. Dominic would return every penny he'd stolen, $160,000 plus interest. He would pay all my legal fees, which were now approaching $40,000. He would receive nothing from the divorce. No settlement, no support, nothing. The prenup would be enforced in its entirety, giving him exactly $30,000 for 6 years of marriage. And we were recommending the district attorney's office review the case for possible criminal charges related to fraud and theft. Ramirez tried to argue. He claimed the settlement was excessive, that Dominic had rights under state law, that the prenup should be challenged. Judge Morrison let him speak for exactly 90 seconds. Then she stopped him. She said she'd seen a lot of cases in her 30 years on the bench, but rarely had she seen such clear evidence of calculated financial abuse. That Dominic hadn't just stolen money, he'd betrayed a trust, manipulated multiple people, and shown no remorse whatsoever for his actions. She approved Patricia's settlement terms in full. Every single item. Then she did something I hadn't expected. She ordered Dominic to undergo a financial management course and to provide proof of employment within 60 days or face contempt charges. She wanted to ensure he'd actually be able to pay restitution and not just declare bankruptcy to avoid his obligations. And she referred the case to the district attorney with a strong recommendation for prosecution. The gavel came down. The hearing was over. Dominic sat frozen at his table, his face gray. Ramirez was already packing up his briefcase, clearly eager to be done with this disaster of a case. I stood up, and that's when Dominic finally moved. He turned to look at me one last time, and I saw something I'd never seen in him before. Complete defeat. Not the manipulative puppy dog eyes he used when he wanted something. Not the calculated vulnerability of a con artist playing a role. Real, genuine recognition that he'd lost everything. He'd tried to take my home, my company, my money, my dignity. And instead, he'd lost his freedom, his reputation, and any chance of the easy life he'd thought he was so entitled to. Patricia touched my arm, ready to leave. But I did something impulsive. Something I hadn't planned. I walked across the courtroom to where Dominic was still sitting. He looked up at me, and for just a second, I saw hope flicker in his eyes. Like, maybe I was coming to tell him that we could work something out, that I'd make this easier on him. I leaned down, close enough that I told him he'd given me 48 hours to leave my own house, that those 48 hours had taught me something important about who I was and what I was capable of, that I'd spent years making excuses for him, supporting him, believing in him, and that he'd repaid that faith by trying to destroy me. I told him I hoped the next few years of working to pay back what he stole would teach him something about the value of hard work, about earning what you have instead of taking it from people who trusted. And I told him that every time he wrote a check for restitution, every time he saw money deducted from his paycheck, every time he had to explain to a future employer or partner why he had a fraud case in his background, I hoped he'd remember this moment, the moment he realized that underestimating Vanessa Cole was the biggest mistake of his life. Then I straightened up, walked out of that courtroom with Patricia at my side, and stepped out into the gray Seattle morning feeling lighter than I had in years. Because it was over. Finally, completely, and I had won. 3 months have passed since that day, and I'm sitting in my home office. The same office where I built my company, the same space where I worked late nights while Dominic played video games downstairs, thinking he'd found the perfect setup. The house feels different now. It's mine in a way it never was before. Every room has been reclaimed, redecorated, turned into something that reflects who I actually am, instead of who I was trying to be for a marriage that was already dying. The master bedroom has new furniture. The living room has art I chose without asking anyone's opinion. The garage has my car and my car only. Dominic's Audi was sold, and the money went toward my legal fees. It's strange how physical space can hold emotional weight. For weeks after the divorce was finalized, I'd walk through these rooms and remember things. His coffee cup on the counter, his shoes by the door, the way he'd sprawl on the couch like he owned the place. But those memories are fading now, replaced by new ones. Better ones. Last month, I hired a financial advisor, the one James from my development team recommended. Her name is Dr. Lisa Tran, and she specializes in helping women protect their assets and build sustainable wealth after divorce or financial abuse. Our first meeting was supposed to be about investment strategy, but we ended up talking for 3 hours about what I'd been through. Lisa told me something that shifted my entire perspective. She said that what happened with Dominic wasn't a failure on my part. It was information. Information about what to protect, what to look for, what red flags I'd missed because I was too trusting. She helped me set up structures to ensure nothing like this could ever happen again. Separate accounts with different institutions. Trusts that protect my assets. Legal frameworks that make my company untouchable by any future partner. I'll never be that vulnerable again. But more than the practical protections, Lisa gave me something else. She connected me with other women who'd been through similar situations. Successful, intelligent women who'd been conned by partners they trust. Women who'd rebuilt their lives and their finances and their sense of self after betrayal. I realized I wasn't alone. It wasn't some personal failing that made me uniquely gullible. Financial abuse happens to people at every income level, every education level, every demographic, and there weren't enough resources to help them. That's when I had the idea. I sold my productivity app company in August for $22 million. It was the right time, the company had plateaued, the market was shifting, and I was ready for something new. Something that mattered more than efficiency algorithms and user retention rates. I used half the money to start a foundation. It's called Safeguard, and our mission is to provide free legal and financial services to people experiencing financial abuse in relationships. We help people like me and people like Madison protect themselves before it's too late. We've already helped 43 people in 3 months. We've connected them with lawyers who work pro bono or reduced rates. We've provided financial advisors who help them hide assets legally before leaving abusive situations. We've created educational content about prenups, about community property laws, about how to recognize financial manipulation before you're in too deep. Madison is actually one of our first success stories. After her lawsuit against Dominic settled $35,000 for fraud and emotional distress, she used the money to finish her personal training certificate and start her own fitness business. She's thriving now, and she volunteers with Safeguard, talking to other young women about recognizing manipulation. We had coffee last week, which still feels surreal. The woman who was supposed to replace me in my own home is now someone I genuinely respect. She's tough, resilient, and refuses to let what Dominic did define her. She told me something funny. Apparently, Dominic's mother, Carol, has completely cut him off. Won't answer his calls, won't send money, won't enable his victim narrative. Carol actually donated to Safeguard and sends me Christmas cards now. As for Dominic himself, I only know what comes through official channels. He's working at a call center in Nebraska, living with a roommate because he can't afford his own place. His wages are being garnished for restitution. He'll be paying me back for the next 8 years. The district attorney decided not to pursue criminal charges after he agreed to full restitution and took a plea deal for fraud that's on his permanent record. He tried to get a job in tech sales a few months ago, but the background check flagged the fraud conviction. He's essentially unemployable in any field that requires financial trust. Sometimes I think about what his life could have been if he'd just been honest. If he'd supported me genuinely instead of plotting to rob me. If he'd worked on building something of his own instead of trying to steal what I'd built. But that's not who he was. Maybe it's not who he could ever be. I've started dating again, which feels strange and new and occasionally terrifying. I'm not in a rush. For the first time in years, I'm comfortable being alone, being with myself, knowing that I'm complete without needing someone else to validate my worth. When I do meet someone interesting, I'm different now. I ask harder questions. I watch for red flags. I trust my instincts instead of making excuses. And I have no problem walking away if something feels off. Last week, I was invited to speak at a tech conference about women in entrepreneurship. I almost talked about the usual stuff. funding, scaling, market strategy, but at the last minute, I changed my speech. I told my story instead. The whole story, the affair, the theft, the 48-hour ultimatum, and how I fought back. The room was silent when I finished. Then a woman in the third row stood up and started clapping. Then another. Then everyone. A standing ovation that lasted 3 minutes. Afterward, I was surrounded by women telling me their own stories. Partners who'd stolen from them, husbands who'd hidden assets, boyfriends who'd manipulated them out of opportunities, or money, or confidence. So many stories, all variations on the same theme. Trust exploited, generosity punished, success used as a weapon against them. I gave them all safeguards information. I told them they weren't alone, that they could fight back, that they could win. Because here's what I learned from those 48 hours that changed my life. You're stronger than you think you are. The moment someone tries to take what's yours, the moment they underestimate you, the moment they think you'll just accept their betrayal, that's when you discover what you're really made of. Dominic thought I'd crumble. He thought I'd be so devastated by his rejection, so overwhelmed by the complexity of divorce, so afraid of losing him that I'd just accept whatever terms he dictated. He couldn't have been more wrong. I didn't just survive what he tried to do to me. I turned it into something meaningful, something that helps other people avoid the same, something that takes the worst experience of my life and transforms it into a purpose. My company is worth more now than it ever was. My house is peaceful. My life is full of people who actually respect. Every morning when I wake up in my bed, in my house, surrounded by the success I built with my own, I feel grateful. Not for what happened, but for what I learned about myself in the process of fighting back. So, if you're out there going through something similar, if someone you trusted is trying to take if you're scared and confused and don't know if you're strong enough to fight, I want you to know something. You are strong enough. You're stronger than they think, stronger than you don't have to go through it alone. I'm here in Seattle, running Safeguard, and building a life that's entire. If you want to follow this journey, if you want to see how this foundation grows and helps more people, follow the stories here. And I want to hear from you. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. Let's build a community of used to be victims who fight back, who turn their pain into power. And if you found strength in my story, subscribe to this channel, share it with someone who needs to hear that they can survive this, that they can win. Dominic became the woman I was always meant to be, the woman who doesn't make excuses, who doesn't let anyone, not a husband, not a partner, not anyone, take what she's built. That 48-hour countdown was supposed to be my destruction. Instead, it became my liberation, and I've never been more free.